I didn't make a scene. That's the part nobody expects when I tell this story. My name is Rachel, and for most of my life, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally made me feel like a guest in my own family, a guest who was never quite welcome enough to sit at the main table. I grew up in Mississauga, Ontario, the second of two daughters. My older sister, Diane, was the one my parents talked about at every dinner party, every church potluck, every neighborhood barbecue. Diane got into Western University on a full scholarship. Diane won the regional debate championship 3 years running. Diane was going to be somebody. You'd hear it in the way my mother's voice changed when she talked about her softer, warmer, like she was describing something precious she didn't want to damage, with too much handling. And then there was me. I wasn't a bad student. I wasn't in trouble. I showed up. I worked hard. I kept my room clean and helped with the dishes without being asked. But somewhere along the way, I became the background character in a story that was always about Diane. When I was 16, I told my mother I wanted to study aesthetics and eventually open my own salon. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has just announced they want to be an astronaut patient, slightly pained, like she was already preparing herself for the moment she'd have to explain why that wouldn't work out. She didn't say anything cruel. She just said, "That's nice, Rachel," and went back to reading the email Diane had sent about her summer internship placement. I learned early that "that's nice" in our house was not a compliment. It was a door being closed quietly, so no one would hear the sound. I graduated high school, enrolled in an aesthetics program at a college in Brampton, and started working part-time at a nail salon on Hurontario Street to pay for my supplies. My mother told the neighbors I was figuring things out. My father, who was a gentleman but a conflict-avoidant one, never corrected her. He'd squeeze my shoulder sometimes when no one was looking, a small apology delivered without words, and I'd take it because it was the closest thing to being seen that I got at home. Diane, by this point, had graduated with a degree in finance and taken a position at a wealth management firm in downtown Toronto. She had an apartment in Liberty Village. She wore blazers and talked about market trends and client portfolios. When she came home for holidays, the whole house rearranged itself around her arrival. My mother would spend 2 days cooking her favorite dishes. My father would clear his schedule, and I would quietly move my things out of the guest room so Diane could have more space. I never said anything. I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something. After finishing my program, I worked at 2 different salons over 4 years, learning everything I could, not just nails, but the business side. Booking systems, supplier relationships, lease negotiations, how to build a loyal client base from scratch. I was good at the work, more than good. Clients followed me from one location to the next. When I finally saved up enough to put a deposit on my own space, a small studio unit in a strip mall in Oakville, I felt like I had climbed a mountain no one else had even noticed I was on. The salon was called Vela. I chose the name myself. It means sail in some languages, the idea of moving forward under your own power, going wherever the wind took you. I painted the walls a warm ivory, put in white marble laminate countertops, hung small gold-framed mirrors I found at an estate sale in Hamilton. It wasn't large. 4 nail stations, 1 facial bed, a small reception area, with a succulent on the counter. But it was mine. Every inch of it was mine. My mother came to the soft opening. She walked around, nodded politely, and said, "It's cozy." My Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister who had driven up from Burlington, said, "Rachel, this is absolutely beautiful." She meant it. I could tell the difference by then. Diane didn't come to the opening. She had a work thing, apparently. For 2 years, I ran Vela on my own, then hired my first employee, a young woman named Priya, who had just finished her aesthetics certificate and reminded me so much of myself at that age that it hurt a little. Then I hired a second. By the time the Christmas my story is really about rolled around, I had 4 employees, a wait list for weekend appointments, and a small but steady wholesale account supplying custom gel polish kits to 3 other independent salons in the GTA. I had not told my family most of this. Not because I was hiding it, but because no one had asked. My mother called occasionally to tell me about Diane's promotions, and to remind me I should be contributing more to my RRSP. My father texted sometimes funny videos, a picture of a cardinal at the bird feeder. I visited for Thanksgiving and Easter, sat through dinners where my contributions to the conversation were received like weather reports acknowledged briefly, then forgotten. I'd stopped needing their approval, somewhere around year 2, of running the salon. That's not something that happens all at once. It's more like a tide going out gradual, unremarkable, and then one day you look up and the water is just gone. The Christmas dinner that changed everything was at my parents' house in Mississauga. My Aunt Margaret was there, and her husband, my Uncle Frank. Diane had brought her boyfriend, a man named Trevor, who worked in commercial real estate, and had the kind of handshake that announced itself. There were also 2 of my parents' friends from their church small group, a couple named the Hendersons, who had known our family for decades, and their adult son, who was visiting from Vancouver. 11 people total, around a table set with the good china my mother only brought out twice a year. I arrived a little late, because I had been doing the December payroll for my staff. I'd dressed carefully, a deep burgundy wrap dress I'd bought at a boutique on Queen Street West, my hair down, small gold earrings. I felt good. I felt like myself. When I came in, my mother was in the middle of telling Mrs. Henderson about Diane's recent promotion. My father took my coat. Diane waved from across the room. Trevor shook my hand with the handshake. My Aunt Margaret hugged me and whispered, "You look wonderful." I believed her. We sat down to dinner, and for a while it was fine. My father carved the turkey. The Henderson's son, whose name was Patrick, was seated next to me, and he was easy to talk to. He worked in urban planning in Vancouver and was curious about small business development in the GTA. We had a real conversation. I told him about Vela. He asked good questions. It was during dessert that it happened. My mother had been talking about a trip. She and my father were planning a river cruise through Europe the following summer. The Hendersons were asking questions about the itinerary, and the conversation drifted to what everyone did for work. It was the kind of around-the-table check-in that happens at family gatherings. Nothing dramatic, just people catching up. When it got to me, my mother answered before I could. "Rachel does nails," she said, the same tone she'd used when I was 16, and told her my plans. And then she laughed, lightly. The way you laugh at something you find slightly embarrassing but want to appear gracious about. "She has a little nail place." She picked up her fork and went back to her pie. 11 people at that table. My Aunt Margaret had gone very still. Patrick, next to me, had stopped mid-sentence. Trevor was looking at his dessert plate. Diane was looking at me with an expression I had seen my entire life, pity mixed with relief that she was not the one being discussed this way. A little nail place. I had 4 employees. I had a wait list. I had a wholesale account. I owned the equipment, had negotiated my own commercial lease, filed quarterly HST returns, and had just that week received an inquiry from a spa in Etobicoke that wanted to discuss a potential partnership. A little nail place. I remember picking up my water glass. I remember taking a sip, and I remember making the decision, very quietly, to say nothing in that moment. Not because I didn't have words, I had so many words, but because I had learned something from years of watching my mother shape the narrative of our family. The person who speaks in anger hands control to someone else. And I was done handing control to anyone. "Actually," I said, and my voice was calm. I made sure of that. Vela had its strongest quarter yet this fall. I turned to Patrick, because I was continuing the conversation we'd been having before the interruption. "You were asking about commercial lease structures in smaller suburban markets. The situation in Oakville has been interesting because of how the mixed-use zoning changes have affected foot traffic." We talked for another 10 minutes. My mother did not say anything else about the nail place. But here is where the story actually turns. My Aunt Margaret stayed after the other guests left to help with dishes, which was something she always did. My mother had gone upstairs with a headache, which was something she did when a situation had not unfolded the way she'd planned. My father was watching a hockey game in the living room. Diane and Trevor had left early, something about meeting friends in the city. My aunt found me in the kitchen, rinsing the dessert plates. "She doesn't know, does she?" Margaret said. "Not a question, exactly." I turned off the tap. "No." "How long has Vela been running?" "Almost 3 years." She dried a plate slowly. And the girl she introduced as running a little nail place, does she know that girl has 4 staff and a wholesale account and just got an inquiry from a spa? She knows what she's decided to know, I said. My aunt was quiet for a moment. Then she put the plate down on the counter and looked at me the way she had at the soft opening. The way that meant she was actually seeing me, and not some version of me she'd decided on years ago. I need to tell you something, she said. I've been meaning to tell you this for a while. She told me that 6 months earlier, at a family gathering I hadn't attended, my mother had been talking about Diane's investment portfolio to a group of her friends. Someone had asked about me, and my mother had said in front of 4 people, as casually as commenting on the weather, that she sometimes wished she'd only had 1 daughter, that it would have been simpler. I stood there with a damp dish towel in my hands. I had suspected, somewhere deep and wordless, for a long time. But suspicion is different from being told. Hearing it in plain language, out loud, in a warm kitchen that smelled like turkey and butter and Christmas, it landed somewhere different. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because you deserve to know. And because, she paused, I have a proposal. My Aunt Margaret and Uncle Frank had been planning for retirement. They owned a property in Burlington, a commercial space, on a corner lot they'd been renting to a bookkeeper for years. But the bookkeeper was retiring, and the space was going to be vacant in March. It was larger than my current Oakville location, better parking, higher foot traffic on that particular strip. They wanted to offer it to me at below market rent for the first year as a long-term lease. They believed in what I was building. They had, it turned out, been following it more closely than I knew. I started crying, right there at the kitchen sink, and my aunt held onto my arm and didn't say anything for a little while, because she understood that some things need to be cried through before they can be spoken about. Your mother loves you, she said eventually, in whatever way she's capable of. But her love has conditions attached that have nothing to do with who you actually are. You have built something real, Rachel. Don't let her framing of it become yours. I drove home to my apartment in Oakville that night along the QEW, the lake invisible in the dark to my right, the city lights of Toronto, smudged orange on the horizon, and I thought about the version of me who had sat at that table at 16 and taken "that's nice" and folded it into herself like it was true. That version of me had needed my mother to see her to feel real. I didn't anymore, but it still hurt. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time, and I think it took me a long time to understand that healing isn't the same as not feeling it. You can be healed and still feel the ache of what the wound was. You just stop letting it make decisions for you. Over the following 3 months, I planned the expansion carefully. Priya was ready for a senior role. I brought on a bookkeeper to handle the accounts I'd been managing alone. I worked with a designer friend on a refreshed brand for the Burlington location, same name, Vela, same ivory and gold palette, but larger, cleaner, with a private room for specialty services and a small retail section for the product line I had been quietly developing with a local manufacturer. The Burlington location opened on a Thursday in early April. My Aunt Margaret and Uncle Frank were the first through the door. Several of my Oakville regulars made the drive. Priya's family came. Patrick, from the Christmas dinner, had somehow heard about it through mutual connections. He sent flowers. My mother was not there. I had invited her. The invitation was genuine, not a test, not a trap. I had moved past needing to prove anything. But I had also decided that her presence or absence at my milestones no longer determined their value. She called 2 days after the opening and asked how it went. She said it sounded nice. I told her it had been wonderful. I meant it without irony. Then I asked how my father's knee was recovering. And we talked about that for a while and said goodbye. Diane called the following week. She'd heard about the Burlington location through our aunt. She asked if she could come see it sometime. I said of course. She came on a Saturday, without Trevor, and she walked through the space slowly and asked real questions. She picked up one of the gel polish kits from the retail display and turned it over in her hands. "Did you design this packaging?" she asked. I said I'd worked with a designer in Hamilton. She nodded. "It's really good, Rachel." I looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in a long time, And I thought about how much of our dynamic had been built by someone else's architecture, how we'd both been placed in roles we hadn't entirely chosen, how Diane being the favorite hadn't made her happy either. Not really. How the golden child in these stories is often just as trapped as the invisible one. Only differently. I said thank you. I offered her tea. She stayed for 2 hours. I'm not going to tell you that everything was resolved, that my family had some dramatic revelation, and everyone apologized, and we all sat down together and rebuilt things cleanly. That's not how it works. And I think you know that, because if you're watching this, you probably have your own version of a Christmas dinner, where someone reduced your whole life to a sentence that fit their idea of who you were allowed to be. What I'll tell you is this. The moment my mother said little nail place in front of 11 people, she thought she was naming me. She thought she was setting a limit. What she actually did was remind me that I had already long since moved past the limit she thought she was setting. She was describing a version of me that had stopped existing years ago. And there is a specific, quiet freedom in realizing that someone's diminishment of you is really just a map of where you used to be. I own 2 locations now. Vela Oakville and Vela Burlington. I have 9 employees. I pay myself an actual salary. I filed my corporate taxes in February. And my accountant, a woman named Diane, different Diane, a coincidence I have never quite decided how to feel about, told me the growth trajectory put me on track to open a 3rd location within 18 months, if I wanted to. I haven't decided yet. There's something I like about where I am right now, about standing in the Burlington space, on a quiet Tuesday morning before the first client arrives, with a coffee from the place down the street, watching Priya set up her station with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned to love their work. There's something in that moment ordinary and specific, and completely mine, that no one who sat at that Christmas dinner table can touch. Not even a little bit. If you're somewhere in the middle of your own story right now, working the job they smile politely about, building the thing they haven't asked about, showing up to the dinners where someone else is always the headline, I want you to hear this, and I mean it. You don't need their acknowledgement to make it real. You don't need the room to go silent for what you've built to matter. But sometimes, the room does go silent. And when it does, you don't have to say a word. You've already said everything that needs to be said. You said it with every early morning and late night, and quiet decision they never saw you make. Let that be enough. And then, let it be the beginning.